The morning sun painted Golden Valley Airport in warm amber light as 8-year-old Sophie Martinez adjusted her pink backpack and followed her grandmother Elena through the small terminal building. Before we jump back in, tell me, where are you watching this video from below? And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's episode is extra special. The regional airport served their mountain community with a mix of private aircraft and commercial flights, its single runways stretching across the valley floor like a concrete ribbon connecting their quiet town to the wider world. Elena worked the early shift at the airport cafe, serving coffee and breakfast to pilots, passengers, and the occasional business travelers who passed through their remote Colorado location. For Sophie, these Saturday mornings had become routine adventures, spending time at the airport while her grandmother worked, and her parents handled the weekend farmers market with produce from their family farm. Remember, Mija, you can sit at the corner table with your books while I help with the breakfast rush, Elena said, smoothing Sophie's long, dark hair with gentle affection. I'll bring you some hot chocolate and one of Maria's famous cinnamon rolls. Sophie nodded eagerly, her bright brown eyes already scanning the tarmac beyond the cafe windows. 3 small aircraft sat quietly in the morning light, but it was the sleek silver jet parked near Hangar 5 that captured her attention. Even from inside the terminal, she could see people moving around the expensive-looking aircraft with what appeared to be increasing frustration. The corner table had become Sophie's unofficial study space during her grandmother's weekend shifts. Elena worked 2 part-time jobs to help support their extended family, and Sophie had grown comfortable completing her homework in various public spaces throughout Golden Valley. She settled into the familiar wooden chair, pulling out her 3rd-grade reading book, while keeping one eye on the interesting activity outside. The Golden Valley Cafe served as the heart of their small airport community, attracting not only local residents but also pilots, passengers, and aviation workers who appreciated Maria's home-cooked meals and reasonable prices. The morning conversations created a comfortable backdrop of small-town life, punctuated by the occasional sound of aircraft engines and radio chatter from the nearby control tower. As Sophie worked through her reading assignment, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the counter between 2 men in coveralls. The older man, whom she recognized as Danny Rodriguez from the airport maintenance crew, wrapped his weathered hands around a steaming coffee mug and shook his head with obvious frustration. Day 3 and that Sterling jet still won't start, Danny said to his companion, a younger mechanic named Carlos, whom everyone called Wrench. Never seen anything like it in 25 years of working on aircraft. What's the problem exactly? Asked Rosa Flores, a maintenance assistant who often stopped by the cafe before her shift. Her curiosity about aircraft problems matched Sophie's own fascination with how things worked. Danny lowered his voice, though his words still carried clearly to Sophie's table. Engine diagnostics show everything's normal, but she won't turn over. Keeps cranking, all the systems check out fine, but no ignition. We've had specialists fly in from Denver, replaced parts worth more than my car, and still nothing. Sophie's pencil paused over her reading worksheet. She had heard her Uncle Miguel describe similar problems during their evening walks around the farm, usually while explaining how different engines worked. The symptoms Danny described sounded like a problem that might not show up on computer. Tests cost them $30,000 already just in labor and parts, Danny continued, his voice heavy with professional frustration. That's not counting the consultants they brought in from Sterling Aviation headquarters in Phoenix. 30,000. Wrench whistled softly, his weathered face showing disbelief. Who owns a jet like that anyway? James Sterling himself, Danny replied, gesturing toward the window where the silver aircraft sat, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and frustrated technicians. The guy who owns Sterling Aviation Corporation. Pretty ironic, right? Man who makes his fortune building aircraft engines can't get his own plane running. Through the cafe window, Sophie watched as several men in expensive suits stood near the grounded jet, their body language showing increasing tension and impatience. One man in particular, tall and imposing in a navy business suit, gestured emphatically while speaking into his phone. Even from her distant viewpoint, Sophie could sense the mounting pressure surrounding the expensive aircraft. Elena appeared at Sophie's table with a mug of hot chocolate and a warm cinnamon roll, sliding into the booth across from her granddaughter. "Everything okay, Mija? You look like you're watching something very interesting out there." "Just looking at the broken airplane," Sophie replied, taking a sip of chocolate while continuing to observe the scene at Hangar 5. "They're having trouble with the engine." "How can you tell that from here?" Elena asked, following her granddaughter's gaze with gentle curiosity. Sophie's ability to understand mechanical problems had always impressed the adults in their family. "The way they keep checking the same parts over and over," Sophie explained, pointing toward the aircraft with her small finger. "Plus I heard Mr. Rodriguez talking about computer problems. See how they keep connecting and disconnecting that testing equipment? That usually means the electronics say everything's fine, but something physical is still wrong." Elena marveled at her granddaughter's observational skills while feeling the familiar mixture of pride and concern that came from having a child whose interests seemed beyond her years. Sophie's mechanical understanding was a gift that came from her uncle Miguel, though both her parents and grandmother sometimes wondered about encouraging such advanced thinking in someone so young. The cafe bell chimed as Frank Morrison, the MUP airport operations manager, entered with the stressed expression of someone dealing with an increasingly difficult situation. His usually neat appearance showed signs of strain, with his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cool morning air. "Danny, we need to talk," Frank announced, approaching the counter where the mechanics were finishing their breakfast. His voice carried the weight of mounting pressure from multiple directions. "What's the latest update?" Danny set down his coffee mug, though his expression suggested he already knew the news wouldn't be good. "Same story, Frank. Every system tests perfect, but the engine won't start. We're running out of conventional solutions. Sterling's threatening to sue the airport for inadequate maintenance services," Frank replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Maria with obvious gratitude. "His assistant called twice already this morning about our insurance coverage. He's saying we're making him look incompetent in front of his business partners." Danny's jaw tightened with wounded professional pride. "Frank, we've followed every procedure perfectly, brought in certified specialists, used original parts, ran every test available. Sometimes complex problems just take time to solve properly." "Time is something we don't have," Frank said, his voice carrying resignation. "Sterling's people are calling this a public relations disaster. They're saying it makes Golden Valley look like we can't handle sophisticated aircraft." Sophie listened to the conversation while pretending to focus on her reading assignment, having completed the worksheet 15 minutes earlier, but using the familiar task to help her think about the engine problem. Her uncle had taught her that sometimes the most obvious solutions weren't correct, and that complex mechanical problems often had surprisingly simple causes that were easy to miss if you focused only on complicated possibilities. If the engine diagnostics were showing normal operation, but the aircraft still wouldn't start, the problem might not be in the primary systems at all. It could be something as basic as a blocked connection, a loose wire, or contamination somewhere that computers couldn't detect. Her uncle had always emphasized that sophisticated testing equipment could sometimes miss simple physical problems that were obvious to careful visual inspection. Through the window, Sophie watched as another man in coveralls emerged from beneath the jet's engine compartment, shaking his head in the same frustrated manner she had observed all morning. The man in the expensive suit, James Sterling, according to the mechanic's conversation, threw his hands up in an angry gesture and walked away from the aircraft, pulling out his phone with movements that suggested barely controlled fury. "What happens when grown-ups can't fix something really important?" Sophie asked her grandmother quietly, her question prompted by genuine curiosity rather than idle interest. Elena looked at her granddaughter with concern, recognizing the thoughtful tone that usually preceded Sophie's involvement in adult situations. "Why do you ask, Mija? Those men have been working on that airplane for 3 days and it's still broken," Sophie observed. "The owner seems really upset about it. I wonder if they're looking in the right places for the problem." "Sometimes problems are very difficult to solve, even for experts," Elena replied gently, though she could see the analytical wheels turning in her granddaughter's mind. "That's why people spend years learning about complicated things like aircraft engines." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, but her attention remained focused on the scene outside. She thought about the countless evenings she had spent in their barn workshop with Uncle Miguel, learning about engines and mechanical systems through hands-on experience rather than textbook theory. He had always emphasized that knowledge without practical application was incomplete, but experience without understanding the basic principles was equally limited. As the morning progressed, Sophie noticed increased activity around the Sterling jet. A van pulled up beside the aircraft, and 3 more men in business suits emerged carrying briefcases and additional testing equipment. These must be the expensive consultants from Phoenix that Danny had mentioned, arriving to solve a problem that had defeated the local expertise. But as Sophie watched, even these specialists seemed to encounter the same frustrations that had plagued the previous efforts. They connected their sophisticated equipment, studied computer displays, consulted thick technical manuals, and showed the same bewildered expressions she had observed throughout the morning. James Sterling's patience was clearly reaching a breaking point. His phone conversations became more animated, his gestures more emphatic, and his posture increasingly aggressive. At one point he walked directly up to Danny Rodriguez and appeared to be delivering what could only be described as an angry lecture, complete with pointing fingers and stern facial expressions that carried clearly across the airport grounds. The stage was being set for something remarkable, though none of the adults involved had any idea that the solution to their expensive problem might be sitting quietly in a corner booth, working on third-grade reading homework while observing their failures with the analytical mind of someone who had learned to see beyond the obvious. As the morning wore on and the frustration around the Sterling jet continued to escalate, Sophie began to wonder if she might have the fresh perspective the situation needed. The question was whether she would have the courage to share her ideas, and whether anyone would listen to a third-grader's theories about sophisticated aircraft engines. Little did she know that within the next hour, her quiet observation and mechanical intuition would transform not only James Sterling's immediate crisis, but also change the trajectory of both their lives in ways neither could imagine. By noon, the situation at Golden Valley Airport had deteriorated into a spectacle of mounting costs and professional embarrassment. James Sterling stood beside his grounded jet like a general surveying a failed campaign, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his confident demeanor replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his reputation crumble in real time. The morning's efforts had consumed another $12,000 in specialist fees and replacement parts, bringing the total repair bill to over $42,000 with no resolution in sight. Frank Morrison approached Sterling with another invoice, his face grim with the responsibility of delivering more unwelcome financial news. "Mr. Sterling, the emergency parts shipment from Phoenix arrived, but the new control module still hasn't resolved the issue," Frank reported diplomatically. "At this point, we're running out of conventional diagnostic approaches." Sterling snatched the paperwork, his jaw tightening with each line of expensive failures. "This is absolutely ridiculous. I've spent more on this repair than most people earn in a year, and you're telling me that nobody in this entire state can fix a simple engine problem." The crowd around the Sterling jet had grown throughout the morning, as word of the mysterious failure spread through Golden Valley's aviation community. Curious pilots, experienced mechanics, and aviation enthusiasts had gathered to witness the expensive puzzle that had stumped multiple experts, creating an audience for what was becoming an increasingly public demonstration of technological defeat. Dr. Sarah Chen, the senior systems specialist who had arrived from Phoenix the previous evening, emerged from the engine compartment with visible frustration, marking her usually composed professional demeanor. Oil stains dotted her white lab coat, and her perfect hair was disheveled from crawling around the confines of the engine bay. "Mr. Sterling, I've never encountered anything quite like this in 12 years of aircraft diagnostics," she admitted, reluctantly. "Every individual component tests perfectly within specifications, but something fundamental is preventing proper ignition sequence initialization." Sterling's patience finally reached its absolute limit. Standing beside his aircraft surrounded by failed experts and growing media attention from a local news crew that had arrived to cover the story, he made a decision born of pure frustration. "Fine," he declared loudly, his voice carrying across the airport with desperate bravado. "If none of these so-called professionals can fix my aircraft, maybe we should let someone else try. Anyone. I don't care if it's a farmer, a janitor, or even a child at this point. Random chance might be more effective than expert knowledge." The challenge hung in the air like a dare, drawing nervous laughter from some in the crowd and uncomfortable silence from the mechanics who had been struggling unsuccessfully with the problem. Sophie felt her heart begin to race as Sterling's words registered fully. She had been watching and thinking about the aircraft's problem all morning, developing theories that the experts hadn't considered. Her uncle had taught her that knowledge and insight could come from unexpected sources, and that speaking up when you had valuable information was a responsibility rather than presumption. But she was just an 8-year-old girl sitting in a cafe booth, and Sterling's challenge was obviously meant to emphasize his frustration rather than invite actual participation from non-experts. Yet as Sophie looked at the Sterling jet and thought about the engine theory she had been developing, she felt a growing conviction that she might actually understand what was wrong. The symptoms, the failed diagnostic approaches, and the systematic elimination of computer-detected problems all pointed toward the lessons her uncle had taught her about looking beyond the obvious. Sophie took a deep breath, closed her reading book, and stood up from the booth. Her decision was made despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Through the cafe window, she could see Sterling still ranting about incompetent mechanics and wasted money. Her grandmother, Elena, noticed Sophie's movement toward the door. "Mija, where are you going?" Elena asked with mild concern. "I think I might be able to help with the airplane," Sophie replied quietly, her small voice carrying surprising determination. Elena's eyes widened with alarm as she realized her granddaughter was serious about approaching the expensive crisis unfolding outside. "Sophie, that's a very complicated machine with important people working on it. Maybe we should—" But Sophie was already pushing through the cafe door, the small bell chiming softly as she stepped into the crisp mountain air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps remained steady as she walked across the parking lot toward the crowd gathered around the Sterling jet. Behind her, Elena quickly followed, concerned about her granddaughter walking into the center of a $40,000 aviation crisis. Sophie reached the edge of the crowd just as Sterling was delivering another frustrated tirade about professional incompetence. She waited quietly, studying the open engine compartment from her new vantage point, confirming the theory she had developed during her morning of observation. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," Sophie said in her clear, small voice. The response was immediate and complete. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, every head turned toward the source of the tiny voice, and 50 pairs of eyes focused on the 8-year-old girl who had somehow appeared at the edge of their professional crisis. Sterling looked down with surprise and growing annoyance, clearly unprepared for intervention from a child. "What are you doing here, little girl? This is not a playground, and these are dangerous, expensive machines. You said anyone could try to fix your airplane," Sophie replied quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the overwhelming attention. "I think I might know what's wrong with it." The statement drew a mixture of surprised laughter and uncomfortable silence from the assembled adults. Sterling's expression shifted from annoyance to outright disbelief. "You think you know what's wrong with my jet?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea how complex these engines are? They're designed by some of the finest engineers in the world." "Yes, sir," Sophie replied quietly, drawing on every lesson her uncle had taught her about standing up for her ideas. "I know. They're very complicated. But sometimes complicated problems have simple causes that are easy to miss when you're focused on complex possibilities." Dr. Chen stepped forward with professional curiosity, intrigued despite herself by the child's confident response. "What kind of simple cause are you thinking about?" Sophie turned toward the respected engineer, grateful to have someone taking her seriously. "Well, all your tests show the engine systems are working correctly, right? But it's still not starting reliably. That means the problem might not be in the computer-controlled parts at all." "That's correct," Dr. Chen confirmed, impressed by the child's accurate understanding of their diagnostic results. "All electronic systems test normal, but ignition sequence fails consistently. My uncle taught me that engines need the right mixture of fuel and air and spark, all at exactly the right time," Sophie continued, her confidence growing. "If your fuel system tests are good and your electronic systems are working, maybe something is blocking or disrupting the airflow, or there's a connection problem that computers can't detect." The explanation drew murmurs of interest from several mechanics in the crowd who recognized sound reasoning behind Sophie's hypothesis. Her logic addressed aspects of the engine system that had received less systematic attention than the electronic components everyone seemed focused on. Sterling looked around at his assembled experts with growing frustration. "Are you telling me that none of you considered checking basic connections and airflow thoroughly?" "We performed standard visual inspections," Danny Rodriguez replied defensively. "But maybe we should do a more detailed physical examination of components that don't show up clearly on electronic diagnostics." "All right, little girl," Sterling said, his desperation overriding his skepticism. "You want to look at my $15 million aircraft? Go ahead. If you can find something that a dozen experts missed, I'll personally apologize to every mechanic I've insulted today." Sophie approached the engine compartment with careful steps, her small hands beginning a systematic examination that her uncle had taught her. Within minutes, her sensitive fingers detected a loose connection deep in the ignition harness, a problem invisible to visual inspection, but significant enough to cause intermittent failures. "I found something," she announced quietly, her heart racing with excitement and nervousness. The crowd pressed closer as Sophie carefully tightened the loose connection, explaining her discovery to the amazed adults who watched a child accomplish what their sophisticated equipment had failed to achieve. Danny Rodriguez quickly initiated an engine test. The Sterling jet's engines turned over smoothly and caught immediately, roaring to life with perfect operation for the first time in 3 days. The crowd erupted in amazed applause as people realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. Sterling stared at Sophie with an expression mixing disbelief, relief, and dawning respect for the remarkable child who had solved his expensive problem through superior observation and logical thinking. "How did you know to check there?" Dr. Chen asked, her professional amazement evident. "Uncle Miguel taught me that when computers say everything's fine but machines still don't work, you look for physical problems that electronic tests can't detect," Sophie explained simply. Sterling knelt down to Sophie's eye level, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility and growing understanding of what had just occurred. "Young lady, you've saved my company from financial disaster. and taught me something important about listening to good ideas, regardless of where they come from. He pulled out his checkbook, writing quickly. This is for you, $10,000 as a thank you for problem-solving skills that surpassed all our experts. But Elena stepped forward politely but firmly. Mr. Sterling, we appreciate your gratitude, but Sophie doesn't need payment for doing what's right. Helping others when you have knowledge that can make a difference is its own reward. Sterling studied the family thoughtfully, recognizing values that his wealth and business success had caused him to forget. Then let me offer something different. I'd like to establish a scholarship program for young people like Sophie who show exceptional problem-solving abilities. No strings attached, just support for kids who see solutions others miss. Over the following months, Sterling kept his promise, creating the Golden Valley Innovation Scholarship that supported dozens of students from rural communities who demonstrated unusual aptitude for solving complex problems. Sophie continued her education with new confidence, knowing she could contribute meaningfully when she applied careful observation and logical thinking. James Sterling returned to Phoenix a changed man, having learned that wisdom could come from anyone willing to observe carefully and think systematically. The arrogant businessman who had dismissed local expertise discovered that true innovation often came from the most unexpected sources. The Sterling jet continued flying perfectly, its engines running smoothly thanks to an 8-year-old girl's patient observation and a loose connection that had taught everyone present that the most complex problems sometimes had surprisingly simple solutions, visible to anyone willing to look beyond the obvious and trust in fresh perspectives guided by sound principles. Years later, Sophie would remember that day not for the applause or recognition, but for the moment she found courage to step forward and offer help when someone needed it. That courage would remain the foundation of every achievement that followed in her remarkable life, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Hit subscribe and keep watching. More stories waiting for you. Tap the video on screen. Just click and enjoy.